Richard Wolff's critique of Donald Trump's trade policies, particularly his aggressive use of tariffs, paints a vivid picture of economic chaos and misguided leadership. Wolff describes Trump's approach as crazy and uncontrollable, emphasizing how these policies have disrupted the global supply chain, undermined American industry, and injected deep uncertainty into corporate investment decisions. This first section will provide a thorough exploration of these themes, backed by examples and Wolff's Marxist economic perspective. Trump's tariff strategy. A reckless gamble on the world stage. Donald Trump's trade war policy can be summed up as an unprecedented attempt to assert economic nationalism by imposing tariffs on a broad range of imports, from steel and aluminum to consumer electronics, ostensibly to protect American jobs and manufacturing. Wolff argues that this strategy is reckless, likening it to declaring tariffs on the world, which unleashed a series of unpredictable and destructive economic consequences. The imposition of tariffs was often sudden and poorly planned, leading to market confusion and retaliatory actions by trading partners. Wolff highlights how Trump's administration managed these tariffs arbitrarily, exemplified by their whimsical delays and exemptions. One notable example is the Vanderline Company, which received extensions on tariff payments, reflecting inconsistent enforcement that further muddied the waters for businesses. This erratic management, Wolff stresses, has destabilized the global supply chains that modern manufacturing depends upon. Multinational corporations, particularly those in the automotive and electronics sectors, rely on intricate, cross-border production networks. Trump's tariffs upset these delicate systems, forcing companies to rethink their investment strategies under an ever-present cloud of uncertainty. Case study: General Motors and the flight of manufacturing jobs. Wolff uses General Motors, GM, as a concrete example of the fallout from Trump's tariff war. Rather than bolstering domestic manufacturing, GM responded to steel tariffs by reducing production in the United States and relocating factories to Mexico, where tariff pressures were lower and labor costs remained competitive. This move contradicted the administration's stated goal of reviving American manufacturing jobs. GM's decision underscores Wolff's point that tariffs can backfire. Instead of protecting American workers, tariffs increase costs for manufacturers, reduce their competitiveness globally, and incentivize offshoring. The unintended consequence is a hollowing out of the domestic industrial base that tariffs supposedly aim to save. The unpredictable domino effect on the economy. Wolff further argues that Trump's trade policies have created a ripple effect of unpredictability throughout the economy. Businesses cannot plan for long-term investments when faced with shifting tariffs and changing regulations. This uncertainty discourages capital spending and innovation, ultimately stalling economic growth. Moreover, consumers face higher prices as tariffs on imported goods raise costs for businesses, who then pass these costs on to buyers. This dynamic erodes purchasing power and depresses demand, contributing to economic stagnation. Wolff warns that the chaos induced by these policies does not remain isolated to the U.S. Rather, it reverberates globally, disrupting established trade relationships and prompting retaliatory measures that hurt exporters and workers worldwide. Wolff's Marxist lens: systemic failures revealed. From Wolff's Marxist perspective, Trump's tariff wars expose systemic contradictions within capitalism itself. The capitalist imperative to maximize profits collides with nationalist rhetoric, resulting in policies that harm working-class people both domestically and abroad. The chaos Wolff identifies is not merely a policy failure, but a symptom of deeper structural problems: the tension between global capital flows and national economic interests. Corporations prioritize profit over patriotism, exploiting cheaper labor abroad regardless of tariff barriers, while governments attempt to shield workers with blunt tools like tariffs, often to no avail. Richard Wolff's second major critique targets the rhetoric Donald Trump employed to justify his aggressive tariff policies, especially the claim that China was stealing American technology and causing an unsustainable trade deficit. Wolff dismantles this narrative, arguing it is a misleading political myth that obscures the real economic dynamics and motives behind U.S. corporate decisions. In this section, we will explore Wolff's detailed explanation of why the stolen technology story is false, how U.S. companies willingly transferred technology to China, and why the trade deficit is fundamentally about corporate profit maximization, not foreign governments. Trump's technology theft claim, political posturing, or economic reality. Trump's administration repeatedly accused China of unfairly taking U.S. intellectual property, presenting this as a justification for tariffs and trade barriers. According to Wolff, this framing plays well with a domestic audience but falls apart under closer scrutiny. Wolff points out that much of the so-called theft is actually the result of voluntary arrangements by U.S. corporations. Companies such as Apple, General Motors, and others have strategically shifted production to China to exploit lower wages and gain access to its vast market. This often involves transferring technology and know-how as part of joint ventures or licensing agreements required by Chinese regulations. Voluntary technology transfer, a business strategy. Wolff explains that U.S. firms' decision to share technology is a calculated economic move. They accept certain intellectual property risks because the benefits, cost savings, market penetration, increased profits outweigh potential downsides. These corporations are not victims of theft in a simplistic sense. They are active participants in a global capitalist system where technology is commodified and traded. This business reality clashes with Trump's simplistic narrative that paints China as a predatory villain. The stolen technology story distracts from the fact that American companies are complicit in their own technology's diffusion through their profit-driven strategies. Demystifying the trade deficit. Wolff extends his critique by addressing Trump's obsession with the U.S. trade deficit, which the administration labeled as evidence of economic weakness and exploitation by countries like China. Wolff argues that the trade deficit is not caused by foreign governments deliberately harming the U.S., but by internal capitalist dynamics. Specifically, large U.S. corporations outsource manufacturing to countries like China and Vietnam to cut costs and maximize profits. This offshoring increases imports while domestic production declines, leading to a trade deficit, the capitalist taboo behind the trade deficit discussion. One of Wolff's most memorable points is that this truth, corporate profit motives driving trade deficits, is a taboo rarely discussed openly in American politics. Acknowledging it would require confronting capitalism's exploitative mechanisms, something akin to discussing our sex lives in polite company. Therefore, Trump's administration perpetuated the trade deficit myth to maintain populist support while avoiding uncomfortable economic realities. Wolff suggests this myth functions as a form of political theater, deflecting blame away from corporate interests and toward foreign nations. Consequences of the myth. Wolff warns that the false narrative around stolen technology and trade deficits misguides policy responses. Instead of addressing the real structural causes, corporate global supply chains, labor arbitrage, and profit maximization, policy focuses on tariffs and confrontations that do not resolve underlying contradictions. This misdirection exacerbates economic instability, fuels nationalism, and further complicates international relations, all while offering no sustainable solution for American workers hurt by globalization. In this third installment, Richard Wolff's critique zeroes in on Donald Trump's mishandling of the economic and geopolitical competition between the United States and China. Far from strengthening America's position, Wolff argues that Trump's tariff war and economic nationalism ironically weaken the U.S. and its European allies, while China adapts strategically. This section examines Wolff's analysis of the shifting global supply chains, the vulnerabilities of Western economies, and the unintended consequences of Trump's confrontational policies. China's strategic resilience beyond the tariffs. Wolff highlights how China has effectively insulated itself from Trump's tariff barrage by pivoting toward its BRICS partners, Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and diversifying its supply chains. These moves reduce China's reliance on Western markets and inputs, making it more economically autonomous. This strategic realignment contrasts with Trump's unilateral imposition of tariffs that disrupt established global trade without securing new, stable alternatives. China's state capitalist model enables coordinated long-term planning that outmatches the chaotic, short-sighted U.S. approach Wolff criticizes. The West's vulnerabilities, deindustrialization, and supply chain fragility. According to Wolff, the U.S. and Europe suffer from structural weaknesses that Trump's tariff war only exposes. Decades of deindustrialization have hollowed out domestic manufacturing, leaving these economies dependent on complex international supply chains. When Trump's tariffs target imports, the West faces supply shocks because critical components and raw materials must be sourced elsewhere, often from China or its allies. Wolff argues this dependency creates economic fragility, making Western countries vulnerable to disruptions they cannot easily control. The irony of the economic war weakening one's own side. Wolff points out the cruel irony in Trump's strategy. The economic warfare meant to weaken China ends up undermining the U.S. and its allies far more. Whereas China builds resilient trade blocs and invests in future-facing industries, Trump's policies destabilize Western economies. This includes increased production costs, loss of competitiveness, and political backlash from affected industries and consumers. Implications for NATO and European stability. Wolff also connects Trump's economic policies with geopolitical instability, especially in Europe. Tariff disruptions harm European exporters and industrial sectors, exacerbating political tensions within the European Union. This strain weakens the transatlantic alliance at a critical moment of geopolitical uncertainty, including challenges posed by Russia and the Ukraine conflict. Wolff warns that economic disunity can translate into strategic vulnerability. Wolff's perspective on leadership and global capitalism. From Wolff's Marxist viewpoint, Trump's failures reveal the contradictions inherent in capitalist nationalism. Attempts to assert control through tariffs clash with the realities of a globalized economy dominated by transnational corporations and integrated supply chains. The lack of coordinated economic policy among Western powers magnifies the chaos and limits their capacity to effectively counter China's rise, which benefits from more centralized planning and long-term strategy. In this fourth segment, Richard Wolff critiques Donald Trump's stance and policies related to the Ukraine war, highlighting how they intersect with economic calculations and geopolitical strategy. Wolff argues that Trump's rhetoric of ending the conflict contrasts sharply with his inability to act decisively, resulting in ambiguity that affects both U.S. economic interests and global stability. This section delves into Wolff's views on Trump's contradictions regarding Ukraine, his alignment with Russia, and the consequences for European allies. Trump's public promises versus political reality. Wolff begins by noting that Trump campaigned on a platform promising to end America's endless wars, including the Ukraine conflict. He portrayed Ukraine's leadership, particularly President Zelensky, as problematic, describing him as an unelected dictator, a stark departure from mainstream U.S. policy. However, Wolff stresses that despite this rhetoric, Trump has been unable to follow through with a clear withdrawal strategy. Domestic political pressures, alliances with European powers, and complex economic ties have left him politically constrained and indecisive. Economic interests behind the ambiguity. Wolff highlights that the Ukraine war is not just a military conflict, but deeply intertwined with economic and energy interests. The sanctions imposed on Russia and the disruption of trade flows impact global markets, including energy prices and supply chains, which in turn affect U.S. and European economies. Trump's indecision, according to Wolff, reflects competing pressures between maintaining a tough stance against Russia to satisfy NATO allies and economic interests favoring stability and access to resources, pro-Russian sympathies, and strategic calculations. Wolff also notes Trump's apparent personal and political affinity toward Vladimir Putin, which complicates his Ukraine policy. This relationship fuels skepticism about his commitment to supporting Ukraine's sovereignty. At the same time, Wolff suggests Trump's stance may be influenced by strategic calculations aiming to reduce U.S. military commitments abroad. even if it risks alienating allies and emboldening Russia. European allies caught between Washington and Moscow. Wolff emphasizes that Trump's walk-away approach leaves European countries in a precarious position. Europe is more directly exposed to the economic fallout of the war and relies heavily on Ukraine and Russia for trade and energy. European governments, unlike Trump, have taken a more interventionist stance, creating tension within the Western alliance. Wolff warns that this discord weakens the West's collective geopolitical power and increases the risk of fragmentation. Wolff's warning: blame shifting and future risks. Finally, Wolff predicts that if Trump eventually withdraws U.S. support for Ukraine, he will likely shift blame for the resulting geopolitical instability onto European leaders, framing them as responsible for the conflict's continuation or failure. This tactic, Wolff argues, is emblematic of Trump's broader political style, deflecting responsibility while sowing division among allies. In this fifth section, Richard Wolff delves into the intersection of race, economic discontent, and political manipulation during Donald Trump's presidency. Wolff critiques how Trump exploited the frustrations of the white working class, redirecting their anger away from systemic economic issues and towards scapegoated minorities. This chapter analyzes Wolff's perspective on racialized economic narratives and the consequences for class solidarity and political discourse in the United States. Economic displacement and the white working class. Wolff highlights that many white workers faced real economic hardships: job losses due to offshoring, weakened unions, stagnant wages, and eroding social safety nets. These systemic problems, rooted in corporate profit maximization and globalization, created fertile ground for political manipulation. However, instead of addressing these structural economic grievances, Wolff argues Trump redirected the white working class's anger toward racial and ethnic minorities, immigrants, and women, effectively fracturing potential alliances among oppressed groups. The myth of the stolen jobs. Trump's narrative of stolen jobs blamed Chinese imports, immigrants, and foreign workers for economic woes. Wolff counters this by explaining that the primary cause was not outsiders, but the strategic decisions of U.S. corporations to relocate production to cheaper labor markets for increased profits. This narrative served to obscure capitalism's role in creating economic insecurity, turning working-class frustration into racial and cultural resentment rather than class consciousness, undermining diversity, equity, and inclusion (DEI) initiatives. Wolff points out Trump's efforts to dismantle DEI programs in public institutions and corporations as part of his broader political strategy to delegitimize conversations about systemic racism and inequality. By portraying DEI as reverse discrimination or woke nonsense, Trump aimed to rally his base by framing diversity efforts as threats to traditional white working-class status and identity. Racial polarization as a political tool. Wolff analyzes how Trump's rhetoric and policies intensified racial polarization. This division weakened collective organizing against economic exploitation and obscured the role of capitalist elites in maintaining inequality. The scapegoating of minorities served to maintain the status quo by distracting from systemic reforms that could address wealth inequality and workers' rights. The psychological dimension. Fear and resentment. According to Wolff, Trump's manipulation tapped into deep psychological fears among white workers. Fears about cultural displacement, loss of status, and uncertainty about the future. These fears were channeled into resentment toward the other, preventing solidarity and fostering a fragmented society vulnerable to demagoguery. In this final chapter, Richard Wolff delivers a comprehensive assessment of Donald Trump's economic legacy, framing it as an illusion that primarily benefited the wealthy while exacerbating systemic inequalities. Wolff's Marxist perspective highlights how Trump's chaotic policies masked deeper capitalist dynamics and left the working class worse off. This section also contains Wolff's urgent warnings about the future of the U.S. and global economy in the aftermath of Trump's tenure. Trump's policies as capitalism for the rich Wolff argues that despite populist rhetoric, Trump's economic agenda consistently favored the interests of billionaires and corporations, massive tax cuts for the wealthy and corporations, deregulation that prioritized profits over workers' rights and environmental protections, trade wars that disrupted markets but failed to protect domestic jobs. Wolff sees these policies as deepening wealth concentration and undermining working-class security. Global trade wars and worker impoverishment. Wolff critiques Trump's tariff wars, emphasizing their counterproductive effects. Disrupted global supply chains increased costs for American consumers and businesses. Retaliatory tariffs hurt U.S. exporters and farmers. The economic nationalism rhetoric concealed that the root cause of job losses was corporate outsourcing, not foreign competitors. These dynamics, Wolff contends, impoverished workers while enriching corporate elites. Europe's economic vulnerability. Wolff highlights how Trump's erratic policies reverberated globally, particularly destabilizing European economies. Trade uncertainty strained transatlantic relations and supply chains. Europe's dependence on U.S. markets and NATO complicated responses to U.S. unpredictability. The economic and geopolitical fallout increased risks of fragmentation and recession in Europe. The sword duel metaphor. One of Wolff's most striking warnings compares Trump's tariff strategy to a sword duel. Trump handed China the right to choose the weapon in a duel, and China is a master of this game, while the U.S. is not. This metaphor encapsulates how Trump's chaotic approach left the U.S. strategically disadvantaged in global economic competition.